Between the early 1930s to mid-1950s, a series of horror movies flooded the cinemas, including Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Wolfman, and are seen as classics that would define the genre forever. Half a century later, that influence would be resurrected in the form of video games. Konami were on the verge of worldwide success thanks to titles with franchise potential including Contra and Metal Gear, and another one was set to define the company for decades to come. Dracula, along with the rest of the notable fictional monsters, were the perfect inspiration for this new title. You might think Akumajo Dracula, translating to Dracula's Satanic Castle, made its debut on the Famicom, and technically it did, but on the disk system on September 1986. Although it was a flop, Dracula's Satanic Castle was one of the best sellers, and was released worldwide the next year for the cartridge-based Nintendo Entertainment System. The rest is history. The NES and horror movies were very popular in the 1980s. Combine them together in one game, it was a guaranteed success, and is considered one of the most memorable on the system, right up there with Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, and Punch-Out! There's also another version on the MSX computer called Vampire Killer, but that's an almost entirely different game that focuses more on exploration. The same way Rondo of Blood is different from Dracula X, so we'll be looking at the NES version. The first couple of games in the Castlevania series I tried out because I heard so many good things about the series were Super Castlevania 4 and Symphony of the Night. The latter in particular is one of my all-time favorites now, so of course I was interested in what the series had to offer. However, when it comes to games designed to be challenging, I've never been mentally strong enough. But October is the month of Halloween, and the second season of the Castlevania Netflix series is almost out soon. I'm in that Castlevania mood, and ready to tackle all vile fiends who dare to stand in my way. Bring it on! Every 100 years, Count Dracula rises from the ashes to bring evil upon this world, and the ancestors of the Belmont family are vampire hunters. Things will be complicated if a Belmont decided he didn't want to have children. Simon is a live Belmont in this time period, 1691, and goes to the castle to defeat him. There is almost no plot to this game other than the fact that Simon walks into the castle and fights monsters. Obviously, the series has expanded tremendously, but chronologically the closest predecessor is Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge on the Game Boy. Set 100 years before this one, which makes sense because that's what Dracula does, rises every 100 years, and the sequel is Simon's Quest, when Simon needs to find all the parts of Dracula to break the curse 7 years later, which is a direct sequel when the developers back then didn't anticipate the series having a timeline this convoluted. So there isn't that much information during this era. Besides, the idea of going to a castle and defeating a giant supernatural force is all you need. Castlevania is one of the earliest NES games not to have a generic cover, most likely because it's a third-party title and look at it. Imagine being a kid in the late 80s and you saw this at a retail store. Okay, it might scare you enough to not buy it, but it certainly stood out from Super Mario Bros., Metroid, The Legend of Zelda, and Excitebike, and it carried into the game itself. With Dracula looking more like Bela Lugosi than this one, the series has evolved into more of an anime franchise with its own unique monsters, but the NES titles are more of an homage to the classic horror ones from the 1930s with a little bit of Greek mythology, including Frankenstein, the Mummy, Grim Reaper, Medusa heads, and the castle itself. It may not be as big as Dracula's castle in Symphony of the Night. In fact, if you're proficient, you could beat this game in minutes. Don't think for a second that you can on the first try. But the completely different forms and rooms give you that illusion that it is. It looks nice for an 8-bit game. It's dark, but in an atmospheric way. Very mature for its time. I also love the music, some of the best on the NES, and is key to any Castlevania title. Vampire Killer in particular has been either replayed or remixed on several titles in the series. It's a lot more energetic, and the music cues are pretty short, but I never got sick of it, apart from Dracula's room, which I'll get to. The castle has 6 levels with 3 stages each with their own checkpoint, and the goal is to fight enemies, reach a boss, collect the red crystal ball, rinse and repeat. The gameplay is as simple as it sounds, but this came out a year after Super Mario Bros. And was a massive step presentation wise. Simon's weapon is the whip, and it can be upgraded as you advance through the castle. However, you can only attack in 2 directions, and it takes a few milliseconds to actually use the whip. It makes sense because that's how whips work, it requires momentum to get a full force. But that makes it harder to time your attack on the smaller enemies, and even though you can take more hits than Mario, you can't control your jumps in midair, so a mistimed leap is a potential instant death. I would give it the benefit of the doubt because this is the first Castlevania title in the series, early in the life cycle of the NES, but Mario and Samus controlled their jumps in midair before. It took another generation for a Belmont to follow suit, and the enemies take absolutely no prisoner. These monsters scared so many back in the 1930s, and I suppose they wanted to give you that sense of villain empowerment in this game, and that amping up the difficulty was the best way to do it. Apart from the hunchbacks and bone-throwing skeletons, the ones that move fast and randomly, those are the worst. You can only vaguely predict their movements, and the goldbacks on stage 16 prove my point. One moment they're under the platform, next thing they're attacking you. Enemies are either too fast, too small, too strong, too high or low to attack, or everything at the same time. I'm not saying it's impossible to survive through, and I've heard that Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse is even harder. Frankly, I don't want to know by how much, not yet anyway. Enemies have better mobility, more hit points, and can attack in any direction. Whenever you get hit, you bounce back mostly towards an open gap, which can lead to instant death. And they're everywhere, so expect at least one cheap moment on every level. The stairs aren't any better. To climb up these, you need to press up or down on the D-pad. Simple, yes, but if you walk on it, you just fall. They also leave you defenseless, and you can't use your sub-weapons either. Speaking of sub-weapons, to even stand a chance against these monsters, you need more than just a chain whip. The castle walls are littered with candles, not to light the way, but provide Simon with useful items, sub-weapons, and hearts, which serve as ammunition. The latter can be misleading because hearts in video games usually mean health, and when I played it for the first time all those years ago, I thought they would be like the rings in Sonic the Hedgehog, or they'd replenish one piece of health at a time. But this is Castlevania on the NES, that would make it too easy. Sub-weapons in a platformer was a new thing back in the mid to late 80s, and are more useful than others. But the only ones worth using, at least when I played it, are the boomerang and holy water because they inflict more than one hit point on enemies when used properly. Be careful though, because if you pick one up, it will replace what you've got, and that's what you're stuck with. Even the multiplier disappears. It's not like Symphony of the Night where you have a choice of power-ups. And why does the invisibility potion appear in places where enemies are almost non-existent? I don't think I've ever been in a situation where it's useful. Some of the more powerful and important equipment are hidden in breakable walls, including large hearts, sub-weapon multipliers, and pork chops that replenish your health. Because there are so many walls and so much time, it's not a bad idea to weapon anywhere that could be a breakable wall, because you'll need everything you can find to survive through the castle. As I said before, a whole level consists of 3 stages, and losing a life sends you back to the beginning of the stage you're currently on. This was before the days when losing a life didn't mean respawning right where you left off. This also means if you lose a boss battle, you don't spawn right where the boss starts. You need to go through a little bit of the stage before having another chance, and losing all your lives gives you a game over screen, sending you all the way back to the beginning of the whole level, even if you're fighting a boss. The first few stages aren't that challenging, which gives you the false impression that it might not be as hard as you think, but that's when Dracula has you by the throat. And once he shows these fangs of challenge, that was bad, you'll be screaming at the television. It takes a lot of skill, patience, trial, and error to beat Castlevania. The stage 12 boss is the one that lets you know what you've gotten yourself into, and stage 13 to 15, if you want to know why NES Castlevania titles have a rep for unforgiving difficulty, this is all you need, and it's thanks in large part to this hallway. Here you have to fight 2 knights while Medusa heads fly both directions, and the Grim Reaper all in one run without any pork chops. Unless you have holy water and a multiplier, it's borderline impossible. Did I mention it's the last stretch, and that losing all your lives sends you all the way back to the beginning of a level? And if you've had enough, well, you lose all your progress because there's no password system. Sure, you get infinite continues, but still. Don't say I didn't warn you. At least on stage 18, the clock tower, when you reach Dracula, even after the game over screen, it puts you right next to his room. The boss battles come down to the correct sub-weapon or figuring out their attack patterns. Although they'll occasionally give you an adrenaline rush, inevitably they'll drive you insane. Especially as I've mentioned 3 times now that you start the entire level all over again if you lose all your lives. As much as I like the music in this game, I was listening to something else just to let go of my frustrations, particularly on the Dracula boss, as opposed to hearing the same music in-game non-stop. But I was able to beat him in both forms. After the castle crumbles, the credits... Actually, I wouldn't call them credits because these are just spoof names paying more homage to horror pop culture. This isn't a surprise as most games developed in Japan have credits like these so that other developers wouldn't know who made the game if it was good and attempt to nick the stuff that created them. Look at Sonic the Hedgehog for example. The Game Boy Advance port replaced these credits with "You played the greatest role in this story" and that's it. Then it starts all over again with either bats or Medusa heads appearing almost non-stop the whole game, and they inflict more damage. So if you thought it wasn't hard enough the first time, this is for you. So, to sum up Castlevania on the NES, enemies have better mobility, checkpoints are scarce, and if you get a game over screen, you start the level all over again. You know what? Everything about the gameplay in some shape or form makes this exasperating to play. But that's the point. It's designed to be challenging. If you could beat it without losing any lives or getting stuck on a certain area, it would take minutes. That's unacceptable for a video game in the 1980s. And admittingly, it wouldn't be as memorable if not for its difficulty. Its horror-themed homage isn't the only thing it's known for. It will always appear on top 10s for hardest games on the NES, a console notable for its challenging titles, and it feels very rewarding when you eventually prevail. Everything about Castlevania on the NES reminds me of the first Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation. A lot has aged well, except for the controls, making it harder than you remember when it was new. And comparing another Konami franchise, it's not like Metal Gear where the controls later in the series become so complicated. Going to the original MSX titles are a good stepping stone to become familiar with them. At least it was for me. I'm not saying stay away from this game, far from it. It may be the first in the series, but I say play either Super Castlevania 4, Symphony of the Night, or any of the handheld titles first. They're a better introduction. For novelty's sake, playing it in the Halloween season, the impact it had on gaming during the late 80s can't be overlooked. Castlevania lived up to the front cover that scared and mesmerized kids in the late 80s and is the catalyst for other classics that follow. It holds up in plenty of areas, but only if you're mentally strong enough.